What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I feel like I'm a little slow on the draw on this one, but I would be remiss if I didn't give my first impressions of what may be the biggest piece of Warhammer 40k multimedia, at least until Space Marine 2 comes out. That being 40k Darktide. So let's totally change the entire MO of this whole YouTube channel from tabletop games over to video games and review ourselves a Darktide. Also, please subscribe to the channel and drop a like on the video, all the YouTube stuff. You've heard the spiel before. Last week was the Darktide closed beta, which let people who applied previously to play a limited version of the game for 3 days, mostly to stress test server connectivity. I streamed a couple hours of gameplay over the entirety of the weekend over on my Purple channel. You can find a link to that down below in the video, but if you check out youtube.com/tacticaltortoisetv, that's where all of my stream VODs go after they're recorded, and you can check out some select gameplay matches from there. That is where all of the footage I'm going to be putting up for you today is from. So before we dive in, what exactly is a Darktide? The game is a cooperative zombie slicing simulator along the lines of Left 4 Dead. Each game consists of a 4-player team moving through a mostly linear mission to complete set objectives, all the while dealing with hordes of zombies. Poxwalkers, alongside specialist enemies and scary bosses. In the game, you and your teammates are the narrative equivalent of
some kind of Suicide Squad.
Convicts who have been drafted by the Inquisition for your
very particular set of skills
to complete dangerous missions so that law-abiding Imperial citizens aren't put in harm's way. At release, there are 4 classes that each convict can hail from: Veteran, Zealot, Ogryn, and Psyker. Now, each one has a subtitle, like the Zealot Preacher, for example, or Veteran Sharpshooter, which I initially took to mean that there would be multiple subclasses for each class archetype, but have later learned that that's probably not the case, and that later subclasses may be reserved for DLC or expansions in the future. That was a little disappointing to me because I do think it kind of restricts the gameplay that each class is reserved to. That said, each of the classes is extremely distinct. Each of them has dramatic strengths or weaknesses, so while you can play any class you like when you sign up to get into a game, the definitively more powerful compositions are ones that lean towards team balance. Veterans are the ranged focus class, with the most powerful guns, but very limited melee capabilities. They're important for dealing with ranged enemies like lasgunners or snipers that could bleed hit points away from your melee beaters, who would otherwise have no recourse but to charge blindly through their line of fire. While they're probably the most classic class, mostly playing like a standard FPS protagonist, they're also likely the hardest to play, given that you actually have to be good at aiming, and getting stuck in a horde of enemies is a very easy way to get killed as a sharpshooter. This is definitely the most tactical class, and at the beginning of the beta I saw a ton of people picking it up, and also losing almost every time, since pure sharpshooter teams were easily overrun by large hordes or armored enemies without the support of other classes. Ogryns are your tanks. They have good crowd control effects, especially like slapping people, and have a boatload of hit points. Their large size draws a lot of fire, so they tend to lose those hit points very quickly, but soak up damage for the rest of your team. They're also really good at carrying stuff, so having an Ogryn on your team makes a lot of the missions much easier at the later stages. Psyker is the one class I didn't get to play during the beta, but they're generally a support character with a little anti-scary enemy baked in. They have a smite psychic power that they can cast that almost instantly one-shots enemies after a slight delay, making them great at knocking down specialist enemies, especially ones with lots of hit points or heavy armor, while the rest of the team deals with a horde. That makes them distinct from sharpshooters, who are good at dealing with low hit point ranged enemies, whereas the Psyker can deal with the big brawler enemies much more quickly, although struggle a little bit against ranged enemies that are in large numbers. Now, for the most part, I was impressed with the balance of each class, with one exception, that being the final class, the Zealot. These guys are ecclesiarchical demagogues filled with the divine light and rage of the Emperor to smite the enemies of the Imperium in his name. And smite they certainly do. Zealots are the melee bruisers of the team, able to equip the heaviest melee weapons to layeth down the smack on both small and large enemies alike. But not only that, Zealots can also equip a variety of ranged weapons, similar to those that would be wielded by the Veteran. Things like autoguns, shotguns, and submachine guns. On top top of that, they're also granted a passive ability that allows them to temporarily survive lethal damage. So while they're not nearly as tanky as an Ogryn, in many situations they can feel like it. So overall, the Zealot has good shooting to deal with ranged enemies, good survivability, and melee capable of easily dealing with hordes or more heavily armored enemies, making them easily the most well-rounded class. Unfortunately for the rest of the classes in the game, I don't really see a compelling argument not to play as a Zealot, and Zealot-heavy teams tended to do very well in my experience. Now that maybe that Zealots just have the best early game and other classes get better as they level up, unlocking new weapons and abilities, but in the limited format of the beta, I didn't get a chance to see that, and the dominance of the Zealot was the distinct impression I was left with, which made the rest of the content feel a tiny bit blander. And on that note, limited content might be my single biggest worry about the game's full release. Now, obviously, a closed beta is much different from a full rollout. According to the developers, many inclusions like maps, missions, enemy types, and weapons that are in the full game were not allowed to be used in the beta. Exactly how many of each of these, I have no way of knowing, but unless it's a lot, I can see a future where the game begins to feel very stale very quickly. At its heart, Darktide is a game about experience grinding. You play missions over and over to level up and progress your character. So if there's not a great variety of missions and a lot of the enemies that spawn in them are the same or at least similar, you're gonna get a lot of repetition. If the gameplay of each class and weapon combination, in addition to swappable abilities that you can unlock as you get to later levels, isn't widely varied as well, I can definitely see some things get boring as an optimal metagame of combinations is sussed out. In reality, however, we're just gonna have to see what the game fully includes on its final release. Darktide's narrative focuses on a chaos cult within a hive city that has taken over a local Astra Militarum regiment and infected the lower levels with nerdly corruption. This is why the majority of enemies that you fight in the game are poxwalkers, or are more heavily armed traitor guardsmen, and why all the missions take place within the confines of city blocks, factories, and workplaces. Like the gameplay, the scenery can also get kind of repetitive, but it still remains very scenic. And that brings me to the greatest strength of the game in my opinion. Darktide may be the best rendition of the 41st millennium ever brought to computer monitor. Compared with the more mainline 40k lore that involves post-human space marines, alien horrors beyond imagining, and literal demons, the setting of Darktide is relatively tame. In an empire of a million worlds, each of those with millions of inhabitants, there are trillions of regular Joe Schmoes in the setting of 40k who have never met anyone who has ever come close to even seeing a Space Marine. And a conflict like the one represented in Darktide is much closer to the scale that they would actually experience. So while there is chaos stuff and a little demonic influence going on, it's mostly some effed up rebels who drunk the Kool-Aid a little too deeply and decided to dabble in some harmless ritual scarification and biological warfare. And this gives us a much better window into the day-to-day lives of regular Imperial citizens than basically any 40k video game, and maybe any 40k media outside of novels has ever done before. Your characters have rich voice lines depending on the background that you've chosen for them. They discuss how no one they know has ever been to Terra. They talk about how they heard a rumor that Adeptus Astartes may have been deployed somewhere else on the battlefront that's much more interesting than where they are right now. And they complain about how creepy their Mechanicus Tech Magos is, and how horrifying it is that she considers human labor the most disposable and easily replaceable part of any Imperial machine. This soaks the game with character, and combined with maps that, while they can get repetitive with repeat playthroughs, are jam-packed with detail and mood, serve to immerse the player in the 40k setting better than any Warhammer game I've ever experienced. Were I to introduce a new member of the community to the setting of 40k, divorced from the cartoony and highly marketable battlefields of the tabletop game, I would sit them down to play a couple rounds of Darktide. A game in which you don't play a bold hero or a noble warrior, but simply a cog in an unstoppable machine, powerless to stop its millennia-long grind to a screeching halt. All of my footage for this video was live streamed over on the Purple channel. You can find that at TacticalTortoisetv. There is also a URL down in the video description. You can also find some select playthroughs over on youtube.com/TacticalTortoisetv. If you could drop a follow over there or a subscribe, either one of those on either platform would be highly appreciated. I fully intend to stream the game a lot once it's fully released. And while there were a few technical and connectivity issues, I for one, I think need to upgrade my computer and at least adjust my settings a little bit, since I did experience some lag while streaming the game, although playing independently was buttery smooth. I hope that these will be resolved once the game fully comes out. They were, after all, the express purpose of the beta. Overall, I am ridiculously excited for this game. I know that there is a danger of the content being repetitive, but at only a $40 price tag, I don't think we're being set up to expect the endless content that a full $60 AAA release would potentially provide. And I know the plan is to update the base game with more content as time goes on, with the game going through seasons of updates, essentially. But in my opinion, the way the game captures the feeling and character of Warhammer 40,000 is absolutely unparalleled, and worth it for that price tag alone. But I'm excited to hear your opinions on 40k Darktide. If you played in the beta, let me know down in the comments what you think. Big thanks to everybody who watched all the way to the end of this video. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have grim Darktide wargaming.